Hi kids, we are here to discuss a very famous poem by a very famous poet. You know how English teachers always say this is going to be the best poem by the best poet, and we say that practically every time we do a lesson. Well, guess what? This is going to be the best poem by the very best poet. The poem we're going to talk about today is Ode to a Nightingale, and it's by the Romantic poet John Keats. You know, the Romantic poets, of course, John Keats was one of the Romantic poets, believed in the healing power of nature. They believed in the power of human emotion. And so in this poem, Ode to a Nightingale, we're going to see Keats sort of working out some of his problems, some of his depression. And he's going to do it through poetry, and he's going to also do it with the power of nature. Now let me set the scene for you. It is May of 1819. The previous December, John Keats' brother Tom had died of tuberculosis, of consumption. And so Keats, in May, in the springtime, goes outside in front of his house in Hampstead, that pretty white house that's now known as Keats' house, and he's sitting under a tree. And the story goes he's sitting under a tree, and he hears the song of a nightingale. No, that's not a nightingale, that's a rooster, okay? Well, you've probably never heard the song of a nightingale if you live in North America, and that's because they don't live here, they're native to Europe. Anyway, he's sitting under the tree, and he hears the song of the nightingale. And, you know, he doesn't actually see the nightingale, he just hears her song. And he is sparked by the song of the nightingale to reflect upon his feelings. Okay? So that was pretty funny hearing that rooster ringtone. But enough of the jokes now, because the poem that I'm going to teach you, going to read to you, is a poem that's really important. There are going to be two ways that I want you to react to this poem. First of all, I'm going to go through it very carefully, and I'm going to explicate the poem for you. That means, you know, English teacher talk, I'm going to explain it. So you'll have sort of an intellectual view of the poem. But after we get through that, I want you to think about the emotional reaction to the poem, your own personal reaction to the poem, and that's the way you will appreciate it. There'll be a couple of words in the poem that I'll be reading that you might not know that I want to go ahead and gloss for you. He talks about hemlock, and hemlock, of course, is a potent poison. Remember the story of Socrates? That's how Socrates was put to death for drinking the hemlock. And hemlock, oh dear, here's my tree. Oh well, such is life. Hemlock is a potent poison, and it kills you by numbing you. Another word you'll hear is the word dryad, and that refers to a mythological sort of wood nymph creature. You'll hear the name of Lethe, the river Lethe, and that of course was a river in the underworld. You would drink of the river Lethe and you would forget all your sorrow. So those are some things to listen for as we go through the poem. We're going to start now with stanza 1, and I'm going to read it, and we'll go back and explicate and talk about it. Ode to a Nightingale. My heart aches, and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk, or emptied some dull opiate to the drains. 1 minute passed, and Lethe-wards had sunk. 'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of peach and green, and shadows numberless, singest of summer in full-throated ease. Okay, let's look together at what this means. He starts out, I think, with probably the best description of sadness that I've ever read. It's so real. Keats is telling us and making us feel what it feels like to be depressed, what it feels like to be sad. And it's because he's walked the walk, and now he can truly talk the talk. Look at how he describes how you feel when you're sad. He talks about how numb you get. He talks about how you feel like you've drunk of hemlock or an opiate. He talks about the fact that he wants to drink of the river Lethe, which is the river that will make him forget all of his sorrows. But that heaviness that starts the first stanza, I think, is absolutely remarkable. Have you ever seen people grieve at a funeral, or people who are in the middle of some sort of tragedy? They're kind of like, you know, they're walking ghosts. Their body's sort of on autopilot. Everything's sort of slowed down. You know, your body sort of takes over. And that's the feeling we get at the beginning of this first stanza. Now, towards the middle of the first stanza, Keats hears that nightingale. That's when the song of the nightingale comes in. And Keats is sort of wondering. He says, how can you singest of summer with such full-throated ease? And he doesn't know, he doesn't understand how the nightingale can feel so happy while Keats is feeling so depressed. Let's look at the second stanza. In this stanza, Keats is attempting again to try to get out of his sorrow. And he's like most of us, when we're sad, when we're depressed, we try to find a way out of our sadness. And I'm going to warn you that this poem is very, very real. The answers that Keats sort of gives us are answers that I think every human being who's felt this sorrow might have felt. So he starts the stanza by saying, "Oh, for a draught of vintage that hath been cooled a long age in the deep delved earth, tasting of flora and the country green, dance and Provençal song and sunburnt mirth. Oh, for a beaker full of the warm south, full of the true, the blushful hippocrene, with beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple stained mouth, that I might drink and leave the world unseen, and with thee fade away into the forest dim." So here's Keats, and he's really depressed. And so what does he say? He says, "I wish I had a draught of vintage." Well, what's vintage? It's wine. He's very humanly reacting to the fact that, he wants to get out of this depression, and so he thinks, well, maybe I'll just drink myself under the table. He talks about the wine in this very beautiful way. He describes it with the sort of different mythological references, tasting of Flora. Flora, of course, is the goddess of flowers, and so he's connecting that with the grapes and with the wine. He talks about a beaker full of the warm south. And for those of us who are keeping track of literary techniques, that's an example of metonymy. The wine becomes referred to as a beaker of the warm south, the south of France, the south of the Mediterranean lands. Look how he describes the poem. Beaded bubbles winking at the brim, and purple stained mouth. Keats is so amazing. You can actually see that glass of wine. You can see the wine. You can see the beaded bubbles winking at the brim. Gatorade. He says, "I want to drink myself under the table, that I might leave the world unseen." Look at those lines. "Fade away with thee." Thee, of course, that's the nightingale. Next stanza. He continues with this sort of search to find comfort. And so he hears the nightingale. Once again, he's amazed that the nightingale is so happy. And in stanza 3 he says, "Fade far away, dissolve, and quite forget what's thou amongst the leaves hast never known, the weariness, the fever, and the fret. Here where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few sad last gray hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow,